What's the emergency?
No problem. All units are by
I'm at the corner of Pleasant Hill and John Young Freeway.
1519 East 18.
Welcome back to Crime Solvers Central. I'm Jace.
And I'm Charlie. Today we're covering one of the most famous unsolved murders in American history, the murder of Elizabeth Short, better known to the public as the Black Dahlia.
This is a case that almost everyone has heard of, even if they only know the name. It's been written about in books, dramatized in movies, debated about in documentaries, and discussed endlessly by true crime researchers.
But one of the problems with this case is that the legend often overshadows the victim. Elizabeth Short was not a fictional noir character. She was not just a headline. She was a 22-year-old woman whose life was taken in a brutal and still unresolved murder.
And because the case has been covered so many times before, it can be hard to separate what we know from what has been invented over the decades, repeated or exaggerated.
Today, we're going to talk about Elizabeth Short as a person, the timeline of her final days, the discovery of her body, the original investigation, the media frenzy, the suspects, and why this case remains unsolved nearly 8 decades later.
And we're joined today by somebody who has already taken a deep look into this case on her own channel, Carrie Droban from Crime Stands Still.
Carrie, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure.
And we want to approach this case with respect to Elizabeth Short as a person, not just as the Black Dahlia legend. And we know that people come into this case because of the mystery, but we also want to be clear from the beginning. This is also a homicide. Elizabeth had a family. She had struggles, relationships, and a life that was cut short.
And the goal is not to sensationalize the violence. The goal is to ask better questions.
Let's begin with the basic facts.
Elizabeth Short was born in Massachusetts in 1924. She spent parts of her life on the East Coast in Florida and eventually in California. By the mid-1940s, she was living somewhat of an unsettled life, moving between friends, acquaintances, hotels, and temporary arrangements.
She was young, she was trying to find her way, and like a lot of young people in that era, California represented possibility.
But after her death, newspapers helped create a public image of Elizabeth that was often more dramatic than accurate. She was described as mysterious, glamorous, troubled, seductive, or dangerous, depending on the angle of the story.
And those descriptions have followed the case ever since.
The nickname Black Dahlia became the name most people remembered, but even the origin of that nickname is debated. Some versions say it came from people who knew her before the murder. Other accounts suggest the press popularized it after the fact.
Either way, the nickname became bigger than Elizabeth herself.
And that matters because the way the victim is described can shape how the public understands the crime.
Exactly. If someone is portrayed as mysterious or reckless, people may unconsciously start asking what she did to put herself in danger, instead of asking who harmed her and why.
And that's one of the central problems in this case.
In January 1947, Elizabeth Short was in Southern California. One of the most important points of the timeline is January 9th.
On that day, Robert Manley reportedly dropped Elizabeth off at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. Manley was a married salesman who had spent time with Elizabeth shortly before her disappearance.
According to his account, Elizabeth was supposed to meet someone there.
But after that, her movements become uncertain. The period between January 9th and January 15th is often referred to as the missing week.
And that missing week is one of the most important mysteries in this case.
Where did she go after the Biltmore? Did she meet someone? Did she leave voluntarily? Was she seen by anyone reliable? Did she stay with a friend, an acquaintance, a stranger, or her killer?
Those questions remain unresolved.
There have been reported sightings and claims about where Elizabeth may have been during those days, but not all of them are equally reliable.
And that is a major issue. In a famous case, witnesses may come forward after reading newspaper accounts. Memories can shift. People may misremember dates. Some people may want attention. And others genuinely believe they saw something important, but are mistaken.
So when we talk about the missing week, we have to hold two ideas at once. It is probably crucial, and it's also very difficult to reconstruct.
On the morning of January 15th, 1947, Elizabeth Short's body was discovered in a vacant lot in Los Angeles.
The person who found her was Betty Bersinger, who was walking with her young daughter. At first, she reportedly thought she was seeing a mannequin.
But it was Elizabeth.
We're not going to go into graphic detail, but the condition of her body was horrific. The murder involved severe mutilation, and investigators believed her body had likely been placed in the lot after death.
That distinction matters. The vacant lot was probably not the place that she was killed. It appears more likely that her body was transported there.
Which raises an important question. Where was the primary crime scene?
The killer likely needed privacy, time, and access to a vehicle or some other form of transport.
And the fact the body was left in a place where it would be discovered suggests the killer was not simply trying to hide the crime forever.
That opens the door to questions about staging, control, risk, and whether the killer wanted the crime to be seen.
Elizabeth was identified through fingerprints. That was one of the key investigative tools at the time.
The FBI had her fingerprints on file from earlier records, which helped authorities confirm her identity.
The investigation became enormous very quickly. Police interviewed witnesses, acquaintances, former boyfriends, people connected to places Elizabeth had stayed and whose names appeared in connection with her.
Robert Manley was investigated because he was one of the last known people to see Elizabeth alive. He was questioned, and reports say he was eventually cleared.
Other names also came up early, including people in Elizabeth's social circle and men who may have had some kind of contact with her.
But investigators were facing several problems at once.
First, they had no confirmed final timeline. Second, they had no confirmed primary crime scene.
Third, the case immediately exploded in the newspapers. And fourth, the brutality of the crime attracted hoaxes, false confessions, and attention seekers.
The Black Dahlia case became a media spectacle almost immediately.
Newspapers competed aggressively for details. The nickname Black Dahlia gave the case a dark, cinematic quality that made it unforgettable.
But that same nickname also helped turn Elizabeth into a character. She became framed as a mysterious woman in black, connected to Hollywood dreams and post-war Los Angeles darkness.
And when that happens, the victim's real life can disappear.
The press reported on her appearance, her clothing, her social life, her rumored ambitions, and her relationships. Some of those stories were based on weak information or outright rumor.
And that kind of coverage can damage an investigation.
It can contaminate witness memories. It can encourage false confessions. It can create pressure on police. And it can make the public more interested in a lurid story than in the truth.
That's one reason this case is still so difficult. We're not just dealing with a 1947 homicide. We're dealing with the decades of storytelling layered on top of it.
After Elizabeth's body was found, the case took another disturbing turn.
Someone contacted the newspapers and claimed that material connected to Elizabeth would be sent.
Then an envelope reportedly arrived containing belongings connected to Elizabeth, including personal documents and photographs.
The items had apparently been cleaned in a way that made fingerprint recovery difficult.
If the sender was the killer, that suggests the offender was not only committing the crime, but actively communicating with the press and trying to control the story.
If the sender was not the killer, then it means somebody else had access to Elizabeth's belongings and inserted themselves into the case in a major way.
Either possibility is important.
That's also where the Black Dahlia Avenger name enters the story. Communications attributed to that name became part of the case mythology.
But with a case this famous, one of the hardest questions is authentication. Which communications were real? Which were hoaxes? Were they all from the same person? Were any of them from the killer?
That uncertainty still matters today.
So we have Elizabeth's final known moments. The missing week, the discovery site, the media frenzy, and the mailed items.
And now I want to bring Carrie into the discussion so we can unpack what all of this means. Carrie, when you first started researching the Black Dahlia case for your own coverage, what was it that stood out to you the most? Was it the brutality of the crime, the investigation itself? Was it Elizabeth, or was it the mythology surrounding it?
I think one of the most fascinating and troubling aspects of the Black Dahlia case is that the murder eventually became larger than Elizabeth Short herself. I mean, most homicide victims are remembered as people, and Elizabeth became a symbol. I mean, the public stopped asking who was Elizabeth Short, and they began asking who was the Black Dahlia. I mean, it's not necessarily the same question. I mean, when you have a crime scene that is so shocking and so theatrical and so unprecedented in its brutality that it overwhelms everything else, I mean, the victim quickly becomes as mysterious character, like in a noir thriller, rather than a 22-year-old woman who had been. And the Black Dahlia nickname just accelerated that process. So it became more about a myth and a fictionalized character than it did about the woman, because nobody really knew who the woman was.
Yes. And so what do you think most people, or what people most often misunderstood about Elizabeth Short as a person?
Well, probably the biggest misconception about Elizabeth Short is that people think that they already knew who she was. I mean, for nearly 80 years now, the public has been introduced to Elizabeth not as a young woman, but as a character, as this sort of seductive femme fatale, a failed Hollywood starlet and a reckless drifter that was living this sort of dangerous double life. But she was a 22-year-old woman who dreamed of working in the entertainment industry. But there is little evidence that she was seriously pursuing an acting career in the way that Hollywood mythology suggests. I mean, she never landed significant acting roles. She had no professional credits. She left behind no indication that she was on the verge of stardom. I mean, that was all made up. So this whole aspiring actress label became a convenient narrative because it fit post-war Los Angeles. So that was a city that was built on glamour and ambition and broken dreams. And so she fit that narrative. She fit the narrative of the femme fatale, which was largely constructed. And I mean, the nickname, the Black Dahlia, was just a perfect example of how everybody wanted to perpetuate that myth. Really, the truth is that Elizabeth was a young woman with limited financial resources. She had moved between friends and acquaintances and hotels and temporary residences, and she was really, for all intents and purposes, transient. She relied heavily on her social relationships and the kindness of others to get by. I mean, she grew up in poverty, and here we are in post-war Los Angeles, that a lifestyle that can appear, pretty peripatetic for people. She really wasn't at all what the media portrayed. And the real tragedy is that she literally became famous for the thing that she never was.
And I do want to talk a little more in depth about that nickname, that character of the Black Dahlia. There are some who might argue that the perpetuation of this character and this ideal was what kept her case in the light. Do you see any merit to that, or do you think it actually did more harm than good?
I think it's probably a little bit of both. I mean, the nickname was undoubtedly helped keep it in the public attention. That's what is really fascinating about it. And it's probably one of the primary reasons that the remains the most unsolved homicide in American history. I mean, without that nickname, she's just remembered as, if at all, as another tragic victim from post-crime, post-war crime. But from a purely investigative standpoint, the public interest can be valuable. I mean, that's what you want in a cold case. You want the public to still want to put pressure on law enforcement and still encourage witnesses to come forward. I mean, even 80 years later, right? I mean, that's what prevents a case from falling into obscurity. But there's a price with this particular nickname because it also obscured the victim and it embellished facts that really were not supported or were just part of that whole mythology, because Elizabeth Short, ceased to be viewed as a murdered young woman, and she became this sort of character in a larger narrative. And so she became a brand, if you will. And I mean, people should not become symbols, right? They're more complicated than that. So did the nickname help or hurt? I think it helped keep the investigation alive, but whether we've moved that needle forward in any productive way is remains to be seen.
You talk about how she became a character and how the person, became like the center of the crime. And we talk a lot about, centering the victim. What would that or should that look like in this case?
Centering the victim, like Elizabeth Short as the victim, asks you're basically asking different questions. You're asking, and I think that's important from a profile perspective because you're looking at victimology, right? I mean, who was Elizabeth before she became a headline is really the question that you want to ask. I mean, what did she want out of her life? What struggles was she facing? I mean, what relationships mattered to her? Those all become really key elements in trying to figure out who her killer might have been. How did her family experience her loss? I mean, what can we learn particularly about violence against women through her story, which is really fascinating. I mean, the Black Dahlia case is such a shocking crime that it immediately eclipses the victim. And so the public, unfortunately, becomes more fascinated by what happened to her rather than who she was, which would give us real clues to who she was. I mean, the media environment of 1947 was very different than it is today. But one of the things that we can learn from it is how sexism really shaped Elizabeth's public image. I mean, women who were young, attractive, independent, and sexually active back in 1947, could really only be two things because they're judged through a moral lens, right? So is she, somebody that lived on the outskirts of society that people would not necessarily remember, or is she this, beautiful Hollywood starlet that met her, her fate? So I think that becomes really important in structuring the narrative, a victim-centered narrative, right? I mean, journalists at the time were not simply asking who killed Elizabeth Short. They were asking, what kind of woman was she? And I think that is still a very sort of dangerous focus that a lot of people fall into even now, which is victim blaming, right? I mean, her beauty became suspicious. Her independence became, reckless. Her ambition became poor judgment. I mean, all of these things that sort of have like a negative bent to it. And that's how we blame the victim. But it must have been her fault, that she was and dismembered and left. And that's the whole femme fatale problem, right? It's that blends into this whole very sexist, dangerous narrative and probably in a lot of ways leads to why we have never found her killer. And I wanted to add too, the interesting thing about the Black Dahlia is I cannot think of another homicide case in history where the victim becomes the focal point. I mean, we call her the Black Dahlia. I don't know any other case. I mean, everyone else we refer to as, Jack the Ripper, for example. I mean, she's the Black Dahlia. So that's really interesting in terms of the analysis of this.
I agree. There are a lot of aspects that go into it. And touching upon a little more the victim blaming portion of it, that is something that we see a lot in a lot of older cases, including her as well and some other victims of Jack the Ripper, for example, but not to the extent that we see for the Black Dahlia. For Elizabeth, when we're talking about her lifestyle, her relationships, her ambitions, how is it that we can avoid stepping into this misogynistic victim blaming? How is it that we can avoid dipping our feet into that?
I think one of the key distinctions, and it's something that I think can be applicable, in cases following the Black Dahlia too, is that it's a distinction between explaining vulnerability and assigning responsibility. It's, Elizabeth, we can look at Elizabeth Short's circumstances, her choices, her relationships, her ambitions, because they help us understand her life and the environment that she was navigating. Right. And we have to avoid implying that those circumstances somehow caused or justified or invited her. And so I think that one of the useful questions that a lot of us could overlay on that is, would we describe a male victim this way? And if the answer is no, then it might be worth reconsidering the framing of it, right? I mean, discussions about Elizabeth had often focused on who she dated, for example. Where she stayed, how she dressed. I mean, we see that time and time again, even now in looking at, victimology, whether she was flirtatious, whether she even wanted to be an actress. I mean, all of those things, those details, they tell us very little about why someone chose to kill her. And I think that that's how you distinguish it. So like risk, for example, is not responsibility. I mean, she may have faced risks that were associated with being young, attractive, financially unstable, living away from her family and dependent on acquaintances. But they don't explain why she was vulnerable, for instance, right? They don't explain why she was murdered. So I think that that's an interesting, we have to reframe it. We have to be careful about how we look at victims and victimology. I mean, a more balanced approach would be, Elizabeth came to Hollywood, rather than saying she came to Hollywood chasing fame and got caught up in a dangerous world. Maybe we can look at it and say, like many young people in post-war Los Angeles, Elizabeth hoped for a better future. I mean, whether that invited acting or modeling or simply like building a new life, those ambitions were ordinary. They're not evidence of recklessness. So we have to really be careful how those are framed and defined. So I think, keeping it victim-centered, we want to say, like, what did her relationships tell us about her life, for instance?
The missing week between January 9th and January 15th is one of the biggest unresolved parts of this case. Why is that gap so important?
Well, I think that gap is really critical because it establishes a timeline for Elizabeth. We would want to know, for example, as investigators, who had access to her during that week. Did she, leave that hotel with somebody that she had flirted with and that later rejected, for example? That was one of the theories, like where did she go in that week? Who did she interact with? Who were her acquaintances? Did anybody see her in that week? I mean, all of that will establish a timeline. Without that timeline, investigators are forced to work backwards, and they're forced to like deal with everything that happened up to that gap. And that gap is really critical. Because it places her in a particular place. I know there's been a lot of theories bandied about that her body was found not where she was killed, for example. So who did she come in contact with that, may have then later moved her? And so all of that is really critical to investigating.
Yeah, I completely agree. And we know that Robert Manley reportedly dropped Elizabeth off at the Biltmore Hotel on January 9th. That was one of the last people who had ever seen her alive. How do you think that we should think about him? Do you think that he's somebody who we should consider a witness, a suspect, or both?
I think he has to be considered as both because, again, we have this missing gap, this week-long gap. I mean, was he somebody that just, saw her? Was he somebody that actually went out with her? I mean, we don't know a lot about that. And I think it's really important that anything that we attribute to him has to be evidence-based. We have to be able to support it and back it up with facts rather than speculation. But I think until we have sufficient evidence of that, he has to be both.
And there are reported sightings of Elizabeth after January 9th, but not all are firm. How cautious should we be with witness sightings in a case like this?
Particularly with this case, I think you have to be really cautious because maybe see only pieces of things. They get dates wrong, they get times wrong, they confuse details, for example. But when you have a case that is sensational as this one, that's compounded even further. And then you have to look at motivation of why people are coming forward. Are they coming forward because they want to be part of the action, part of the sensationalism? Are they adding or fueling the narrative? I mean, so it becomes even more complex than in a quote unquote, ordinary homicide.
If there was one missing fact that you could recover from her final week, what would it be?
I think it's probably the question that is in most people's minds when they look at this case is, who did she leave with from the Biltmore? I mean, that is the last known sighting. And if we knew, and it's really quite incredible because this is a very public setting. And presumably there are a lot of people going back and forth, from the Biltmore. It was a pretty prestigious building. You would think that somebody had seen something. And so I think if we knew who she left with, that would at least, again, help us with a timeline and help us narrow down some suspects.
I actually have a quick side question. I don't know if you know the answer or not, but I was just looking back and we're talking about the Biltmore and Robert Red reportedly dropped her off. Do we know if anybody else at the hotel saw her, like the person working the front desk, or do we?
From what I
Do we
know,
know?
Matt, nobody has really come forward. I mean, there is
Okay.
not anything that's been substantiated. People have said, they've heard sightings of her, but it's sort of without that evidence base, it's really difficult to establish who actually saw her and whether or not their perception of that was caught up in the whole sensationalism of the case. They knew who she was, and that's the other thing. I mean, she was this very sort of outgoing, vivacious person, so they knew that about her. So it's difficult to attribute whether or not they remember her from that particular night or whether they're remembering her in general as a regular at the Biltmore.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying. I had that thought really quick. So do you think it's likely that she knew her killer?
I think it's always a possibility. I think that, one of the things that a lot of the reporters have said about her and some of the people that have written, books on her have said that she was very flirtatious. And one of the things that she liked to do was, I don't want to use the word lead people on because that's, pejorative, but that she would flirt to the point where people would think that they were going, able to go out on a date with her and then she wouldn't follow through. And so I think one of the theories on that is that she may have done that with the wrong person, may have given the wrong person the wrong impression. And the rejection was what fueled that rage or that anger. So that's a possible theory. So do I think she knew her killer? I think it's very possible that she did.
Taking a step back to look at the crime scene itself, her body was left in a vacant lot. We know it was left in the open where it could be discovered. Do you think that suggests any, just an ordinary disposal? Do you think it was staged? Do you think it was some sort of message to somebody?
I think it absolutely was staged. And the reason I say that is because there is evidence that the body was moved to this second location. She was posed and drained of blood and bisected. So I know that's pretty graphic for the listeners, but if it was somebody that wanted to just dispose of the body and make sure that she was never found, there would be no reason for the person to move the body, for the person to leave it so preserved so that somebody would find it. I mean, it was literally on a path where a passerby did find it. So I think that all of those things point to somebody that wanted it to be known that she was murdered. Not necessarily that the person wanted his identity to be known, although I think there's some evidence to support that, but certainly that he moved it and wanted it displayed in such a graphic way.
Given that, would you say they wanted the public to react?
Possibly. I think that later communications from the person who wanted to be known as the killer, I think wanted to communicate or wanted to get credit for that. The shock value behind it makes me think that he wanted it to be public, the sensationalism of the crime. But I think it would be pretty amazing if the killer ever anticipated the kind of sensationalism that surrounded her death. I mean, I think the evidence that has been gathered pointing to the various suspects suggests that he wanted the credit to be known that he's the one that did this, not necessarily that Elizabeth Short would then become the symbol and the brand of the entire case. I think that was probably surprising to everyone.
I agree, yeah. And it's led a lot of people to speculate that the killer had medical history or anatomical knowledge. How much weight do you think that we should give that theory?
I think that's pretty important because I think that it does, the the way the body was preserved, the way she was found, I think does demonstrate that the killer knew what he was doing. And I did want to just mention, I don't believe, if we go back to the staging of this, I don't believe that this established any type of pattern with the killer, for example. I think that this was a one-off. I know there's a lot of speculation on that and then probably get a lot of controversy on it, but I do think that based on the way that she was displayed, the way that the skill, if you will, with how the body was preserved, I think does point to the pathology of the killer, the skill set, the knowledge of the killer. I mean, this was somebody who certainly had some sophistication of anatomy, knew what he was doing, and probably had access at least to the tools that he needed to be able to display the body like this.
How do we avoid building an entire suspect theory around one assumption, like the killer must have been medically trained?
I think that you have to have a lot of different components. I mean, one is you establish a timeline. You establish whether or not there's a possibility that Elizabeth knew her killer. Did they have a relationship? So you can try to narrow down the scope of, because if you look at just anatomical knowledge, for instance, then you're looking at, okay, every surgeon in the area, right? Somebody that had everything from a surgeon to a butcher, for example. That's how large the scope of theory of suspects could be. But when you start to narrow that down with timelines, with, what is the evidence source of all of this? Who would have had proximity, for example, to the area? If this was a second crime scene or a place where the body had been moved, the person had to have had transportation, right? I mean, so all of those things sort of factor into back to the original question, what is the message that this killer wanted to send? Was it a rage killing? Was it somebody that had been rejected or rebuffed by Elizabeth's or his advances to Elizabeth? I mean, all of those things will help to establish and narrow down suspects so that you don't have, this very wide berth of suspects.
And what do you think it can tell us about the suspect, the idea that her body was moved to that vacant lot, considering there's a lot of evidence that the murder itself happened at a different location?
It can suggest a couple of things. I mean, one, it's the killer may have lived in the area, number one. There's something about the area that is significant. And of course, this area is very different from today, right? In 1947, it was a much different kind of neighborhood. So you want to look at like proximity to the Biltmore, for example, which would be a very telling piece of the investigation, So was it something that had any type of meaning to Elizabeth, for instance? So it's not only, so you're looking at all of those factors, which is why victimology is very important, as well as the pathology of the predator. And you look to motive, so if there was a motive for the killer to move the body, to display the body, how far away would he have had to have been? I mean, when did he do it? Obviously would have had to have transportation, because you can't, transport a body like that and without being seen. He wanted it to be seen in a certain way at a certain time. And so I think all of those factors are really important.
And what does the scene where she was found, that scene, what does that tell us? Did it feel organized, disorganized, a mix of both?
I think it's probably a mixture of both, because we don't know enough about the offender. And I think if somebody were to build a profile on him, they would say that it was mixed, because you have the transport, for one, that's organized, right? You have to have planning involved in that. You have to have the cleaning of the body. The body was drained of blood. So all of that takes some kind of, forethought, right? So this isn't just, I'm so angry at you, Elizabeth, I'm going to slash you and leave you bleeding out in, wherever I found you. So that clearly would have been a disorganized killer. The public placement also suggests that this is organization and control, right? There's a certain way that he wanted the public to find her. I think he was in a way bragging about his skill set and how he was able to do this without anybody, suspecting him. The brutality is what suggests rage and maybe even fantasy. Here's a woman, if we take the theory that she rejected him, I mean, let's say that she knew him and she rejected him. I mean, the rage that would go into that, the fantasy or the compulsion of I'm going to show you, right? You don't reject me. I'm going to do this to you and you'll never see the light of day again. So all of that, it suggests sort of a mixture of both. I mean, it's possible the killer heard her and then said, now I'm going to send a message to all the other young women out there who might be flirtatious, etc. So there's a lot of theories I'm throwing out. Some of them are based in evidence and some of them are just based on the pathology of what we believe the predator may have exhibited.
And I also believe there's some merit to that because we know after the murder, someone sent belongings that seemed to belong to Elizabeth to the newspaper. What information does that give us?
So again, it tells us that the killer had access to Elizabeth, right? Elizabeth's belongings. And so if the sender was the killer, it's communicating the message that a sort of braggadocio, right? I mean, I've got all of these things that belong to her. You'll never find me. I'm going to send them to you as a sort of, I gotcha message, right? I mean, I've done this and you're never going to find me. And it's also suggesting that someone who is close enough to Elizabeth to be able to take those things that might communicate a message to whoever's reading the newspaper, for example, I mean, these are things that are of personal nature. It's very diabolical and this sounds like it's almost too soft for what it means, but mean-spirited, right? It's diabolical and mean-spirited because it's adding another layer to the brutality of the murder.
So assuming that it was the murder that sent those items in, they were cleaned in a way that made fingerprint recovery very difficult. Does that speak to the sophistication of the murder?
It suggests an awareness. I mean, clearly the killer knew that if he's going to send belongings in, they're certainly going to analyze it for prints and he'll be caught, right? So it definitely indicates that the killer had an awareness, not necessarily an advanced sophistication, because it's a risk to send in items like that, right? I mean, if he truly wanted to remain anonymous, first of all, he wouldn't have displayed the body the way he did and giving clues to his possible identity, and he wouldn't have sent in belongings of Elizabeth, which would further lead investigators to possibly identifying who he was. So I think that by the 1940s, fingerprints were a well-known way of catching a suspect. So he certainly would have understood the ramifications of that, which also indicates that he had some cursory knowledge of police methods. So all of that, every step that the killer took in this case is another sort of clue to his identity, to what he was aware of. So we know that the killer wasn't an idiot, right? We know that he wanted his methods to be known. So that tells us he wanted to be credited in some way, in similar ways to, and I'll just invoke the Zodiac killer here. Here are some items and artifacts, and you'll never catch me, but I want you to know that I got away with it.
Do you believe that was the message? Do you think that it was meant as a communication to the police? Do you think it was to the press also, or do you think it was just for their own ego? Or do you think it might be a combination of those?
Well, I think it's certainly possible it's a combination of the two. I mean, I think anytime you're sending messages to the media, right, you're taunting the police, you're taunting the investigation, you're certainly feeling like you're superior to the investigators, right? Because they haven't been able to catch you and they never will. And so I think there's definitely part of that where he's already tapped into the idea that this is a sensational case. The public is fascinated by it and is going to read every word of it. So he's got their attention. So that's certainly feeding into his ego, his own narcissism, if you will. So I think there's definitely a possibility of that.
How much do you think the media helped or hurt this investigation?
So I think the media helped it in the sense that it kept the investigation going. because it kept the public interest in solving it going. So that would invariably put pressure on police, put pressure on witnesses, for instance, to come forward. But it's also complicated because you don't know who to believe. You don't know what information to trust. You don't know what's real and what's, people are capitalizing on the sensationalism of the case, so they're coming forward because they want to be a part of it, but they don't really have any information. So it makes it much more complicated in a lot of ways for police, for investigators, because they have to sift through every clue. And some of that is going to create unbearable backlog, which it did in this case. I mean, it's still unsolved 80 years later, but people are still fascinated by it.
And when modern viewers try to go and do some research on Elizabeth's case, when they try and look at old newspapers, what is it that they should keep in mind?
Definitely the bias of the newspapers. This was a period where journalists were competing for stories. They didn't have other outlets. I mean, today we have so many other outlets. We have the internet, YouTube, we have like internet sleuths. We have people that there's so many resources and sources. But back in the 1940s, newspapers were competing for the story. And so they were literally falling all over themselves to try to get headlines, front page news. So I think when you research this, you have to be careful what the angle is. And, there was so many people coming forward wanting to be a part of this case. I mean, you have potential false confessors, you have potential witnesses that really didn't see what they said they saw. So I think that creates an even greater challenge for journalists today trying to write about that case, because you have to really take it in the historical context of what was going on at that time and the perception, or I guess the branding, if you will, of Elizabeth Short. The fact that they wrote about her as a femme fatale, as a Hollywood starlet. I mean, it's not true. It's inaccurate. And so I think you have to kind of start from the beginning and form a completely different thesis if you're going to get to the heart of where this case was going.
Do you think that image, them, creating the image of this femme fatale and all of that, made the public less sympathetic to her?
I think it absolutely changed the narrative, or at least refocused the narrative, because you had that whole moral bias involved in that. You had people that were judging her and judging her unfairly without evidence to support a lot of their judgments. So they had to frame their own narrative that fit what they perceived the Black Dahlia to be, right? I mean, so I think that was definitely problematic, and it led to victim blaming, right? I mean, she was suddenly characterized as this promiscuous starlet, who came to Hollywood and didn't make it, so she kind of fulfilled her own destiny in their eyes. So I think there was a lot of that going on that made it very difficult to actually get to the real victim profile.
And we mentioned how this case attracted a lot of false confessors. Why do you think infamous cases like these draw people that claim responsibility?
So that is a very complicated pathology. I think there are people that really want attention. There are a couple of different theories. I mean, there are people that want attention, so they'll come forward and they say, I did it, or I know who did it. And then there are the people that are brought in as suspects, and there's the pressure on law enforcement to get a suspect, right? So they browbeat them into a confession, and the circumstances or the environment of how they're getting that confession really attribute or contribute a lot to people falsely confessing. And so it's something that anytime someone confesses to a crime, you want to look at, all aspects of it. Did they have motive, opportunity, proximity? Was there a relationship? I mean, how much can they rely on the confession that's being given? So I think that just complicates cases like this.
The things you just mentioned, the things we have to look at when somebody confesses, do you believe that that's how they would look at it back in 1947? How would they test that confession compared to how we might look at a confession today?
Given the context and the sensationalism of this case, I think that a lot of law enforcement might be reluctant to test the confession, right? Because they're trying to solve this case and they want someone to come forward. But if you're taking it in the lens of, this is a criminal investigation, we have to test every theory, then you might test an alibi, for example. You might test motivation, put the confessor into the timeline that you've constructed to see if there's a possibility that this person really had access to Elizabeth Short or proximity to her, or would have even been in the area on that 1 week, the gap in the time frame. All of those things would be used to test the confession, which is one of the reasons in criminal law where you don't go to trial based on a confession alone. I mean, you can't. You have to have so many other factors that support that confession or refute it.
And do you think that false confessions actually make it easier for the killer to get away?
I do think false confessions do take time away from the actual investigation. Every time somebody confesses, police have to investigate it. They have to use up valuable resources and time and energy to ascertain whether or not this confessor is legitimate. Does the person have another ulterior motivation? Are they just trying to get involved in a sensational case? Do they fit the timeline? Did they even know Elizabeth Short? Were they anywhere near the Biltmore during that 1 week gap? I mean, all of these things the police have to ascertain each and every time somebody comes forward, which is, one of the reasons why criminal cases don't rely exclusively on confessions, because the whole case would fall apart if that were to happen. So I think that it's unfortunate, but I think particularly in a case like this where it's so sensational, you have so many different motivations for people coming forward and wanting to be a part of it somehow, some way. So confessing falsely is one way to get onto the world stage.
Now, do you think the Black Dahlia case is hard to solve because there are too many clues, not enough clues, contamination, false witnesses? Is there really one thing even we could point to and be like, that's why this case is so hard to solve? What are your thoughts around that?
I think it's a combination of all of those factors. I mean, this case really took on a life of its own. There were real clues. There were real leads that police were following, but there were also real hoaxes. There were lots of false starts and false confessors and things that were taking the case into so many different directions that it drained and strained resources and also got the public's ire up. I mean, they were angry that this wasn't solved. So they put a lot of pressure on the LAPD and that pressure at some point, as the years go by, you have, maybe once upon a time, there was one lead investigator that was assigned to the case that really dug deep into it and did some amazing work. And then that person retires. And then the case gets shelved, right? And so then the next person that replaces that retiree has to come on board. And so I think there are a lot of those factors and they impact a lot of cold cases. But I think this one in particular, just because it was so media hyped and so sensational, it's like whoever puts their hands on the Black Dahlia case is now in it, right? They're in it to solve it, and it can be all consuming.
Over the years, many suspects have been proposed.
Some were people Elizabeth knew. Some were questioned during the original investigation. Others were named decades later by authors, researchers, relatives, or former law enforcement officers.
One of the most famous theories involves Dr. George Hodel, whose son Steve Hodel has argued publicly that his father was responsible.
That theory has remained popular because it has dramatic elements. A doctor, a powerful personality, family accusations, alleged connections, and a former LAPD detective making the case.
But as we always say, a compelling story is not the same thing as proof.
Other names have appeared over the years as well, including Robert Manley, Mark Hansen, medical students, nightclub figures, and more recent theories involving people who were not central to the earliest public narratives.
But every suspect theory has to answer the same basic questions. Did this person know Elizabeth or have access to her? Can they be placed in Los Angeles at the right time? Did they have a private location? Do they have transportation? Is there any physical evidence? Is there any reliable witness evidence?
And does the theory explain the mailed items, the staging, the missing week without forcing facts to fit?
Now, when you look at theories surrounding the possible suspects in this case, what is it that separates a strong suspect from a theory that only sounds convincing?
So a strong suspect would need to have access. They would need to fit in that timeline. They would need to have a motivation, even though motive is not something that is ever really touched on in a criminal prosecution. It's certainly something that helps build a legitimate profile, suspect profile. I mean, like who would have the motivation to want to murder Elizabeth Short? I mean, that's huge in an investigation. And I think that proximity to her, documentary evidence. I mean, there are all kinds of ways and resources to corroborate a legitimate suspect. So I think all of those factors come into play.
Why do you think the George Hodel theory has remained so prominent?
I mean, in many ways, he fits the narrative, right? I mean, he's a doctor, so clearly anatomical knowledge of, and that fits how Elizabeth was found. Family accusation, right? I mean, that's really strong. We have your own son, I think, was accusing him of being the murderer. Alleged corruption. You have, I think his son, who is a former detective, has a lot of credibility and weight because, he's in the law enforcement arena and he's able to say there was a lot of corruption. There was a lot of, hiding evidence. So it feels like it completes the story. It feels like it fits. And I think there was a lot of validity to the son coming out and naming his father, which I think is pretty striking. I don't know too many cases where that happens, So, so I think it was strong, but I think it still has to be evaluated against the evidence.
And we have talked about possible suspect profiles, but in your opinion, do you think that the killer was more likely someone that Elizabeth knew personally? Or do you think that it was somebody who crossed paths with her during the missing week?
It's possibly both, but I think that because of her sort of vivacious personality, I think she would have had access and known a lot of people, and flirted with a lot of people. I think it would have been somebody who gained her trust and access is probably more likely who it was. But it could also be a predator or a stranger, an acquaintance. I mean, I think the problem with this case is that there are so many possible suspects, possible people, just because of her personality in a lot of ways. I mean, she was a social butterfly. She was out there meeting and interacting with a lot of people and very friendly with a lot of people. And I think that she would have had the opportunity to come across people that wanted to harm her.
Could this be a crime that involves more than one person?
I mean, I think that that's something that really hasn't been proven. It's sort of up there with the multiple suspect theory. But I don't know that there are really indications or support for it being, a joint effort. I don't think there's really been anything that's come forward that says this is an accomplice, they're involved in an accomplice. And I don't really know, just from the narrative that we have and the little that we know of who Elizabeth Short was, I don't know that makes a whole lot of sense to have two people involved in this case, or this crime.
Do you think there are any theories involving suspects that you think that people should be especially cautious about?
I think that people should be cautious about anything that is derived from rumor, that seems like you're trying to fit the square into the round peg, or however that one goes, retrofit it into the evidence. I think that, and there's been quite a bit of that, I think, in an effort to try to find the killer. I think you have to be careful of storytelling, like family rumors that come out, and people trying to make it fit. Because the problem is the narrative that's been put out there is also suspect because it's not accurate. So when you try to put a narrative out about who Elizabeth Short was and, she's become larger than life, and now you're trying to fit suspects into that pattern, it's not an accurate portrayal. So I think the better approach is to look at the crime scene itself, to look at what is the evidence telling you? What is the timeline telling you? Who had possible access and motive? All of those things make it more likely that the suspect is somebody who had proximity to her and had a reason to kill her.
Nearly 8 decades have passed since Elizabeth Short was murdered.
And that means many witnesses, suspects, investigators, and family members are gone.
Physical evidence may be lost, degraded, or contaminated.
But cold cases have been solved after decades when preserved evidence, DNA technology, genetic genealogy, or newly discovered documents come together.
So when we ask whether the Black Dahlia case can still be solved, we have to define what solved means.
A courtroom conviction may not be possible if the killer is dead.
But a historical resolution could still matter.
If investigators found usable evidence pointing to one person, or if documents emerged that confirmed a suspect, that could bring clarity even without a trial.
And do you think that this case can still be solved in a meaningful way?
Well, I think that, with advances in technology, with the more artifacts that are uncovered in this case, there's always a possibility. I mean, this is 80 years later, right? And so I think it's really difficult to come up with new theories and new evidence, but it happens all the time. And there's so many books written on this case. There are so many new theories that have been developed. So I think that it's always possible. It's always possible to solve it. I think one of the more fascinating theories that has come forward is this idea that the Black Dahlia Avenger, who was sending letters and sort of riddles to newspapers, may have actually either been the Zodiac or had connections with the Zodiac killer, because you're looking at, ciphers now. So I think those kinds of theories are really fascinating and interesting, and they would not have been as scrutinized probably back in the 1940s. So I think new ways of looking at the evidence that was there is definitely a possibility.
What kind of evidence would we need now to be comfortable saying this is most likely the person who killed Elizabeth Short?
I mean, ideally, it would be strong forensic evidence. I mean, if there was a way to get DNA off the artifacts that were sent into the newspapers. I know they didn't find fingerprints because the suspect was really careful not to leave any. There has to be, I still am a firm believer that somebody somewhere down the line knows something, right? And has not come forward. And a lot of times that's, a family that has artifacts left from the suspect. I mean, it's very likely at this stage that the suspect is no longer alive, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't stop looking and start trying to solve this decades old. But I think that would be the most helpful in this case.
Absolutely. And do you think that sometimes people want the truth to be more dramatic than it actually is?
Yes. Unfortunately, yes. I think that particularly in a case like this that's so sensational, I think it would be, in some ways, I think people would perceive it as a letdown, for example, if it just was like an ordinary result, ordinary resolution to an extraordinary tale. So I think that it does factor in and play a big role. And that's unfortunately, again, one of the downfalls of, what media can do, the impact or influence of media on a case like this.
Yeah. And to that point, what role should modern true crime creators play in a case or types of cases this old?
Well, I think it's really important to stick to facts. I think to clarify the facts, to correct the facts. Newspapers, journalists are all competing and vying for stories. So their goal is very different from law enforcement's goal, for instance. I mean, their goal, and I'm going to be really cynical here, is to sell papers or to sell, their online news or get people to listen to them or watch them. I mean, whatever it is, their goal is very, very different. And I think for law enforcement, they want to constantly correct the narrative, correct it with facts, clarify it with facts, and center on the victim. Like, rather than blaming the victim, center on the victim, because that's where you get victimology and you get pathology, you get insights into the predator by studying the victim. And so if you don't have the victim profile correct, then how could you possibly have the predator correct? So I think those are some very, I don't want to say easy because that's oversimplifying it, but very logical and necessary steps in any cold case, but particularly one like this that is just so sensational. Nobody knows really what the truth versus the lie is. And so I think that would be a great place to start.
After all of your research and after our discussion today, what is it that you feel Elizabeth deserves when people are discussing her case publicly?
Well, I think it's worth remembering that Elizabeth was a human being. She was not a brand. She's not a myth. She's not somebody that lives in the ether. I mean, she had a life. She deserves humanity. She deserves accuracy. She deserves respect. And I think that she deserves, above all, to be remembered as Elizabeth Short and not as the Black Dahlia.
What stands out to me is how much this case became a mirror for the culture around it.
Post-war Los Angeles, Hollywood dreams, newspaper competition, fear of violence, judgment of women, fascination with darkness. All of that got layered onto Elizabeth Short.
And over time, the case became almost impossible to separate from the atmosphere around it.
But when you strip away the nickname, the rumors, and the noir imagery, you're left with a young woman who was murdered in a family that never got justice.
The missing week matters. The original investigation matters. The letters matter.
The suspect theories matter. But Elizabeth matters most. And that is the part that people should not lose sight of.
Carrie, thank you so much again for joining us today and sharing your insight.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to discuss this case.
Everyone watching, please check out Carrie Droban on Crime Stands Still on her YouTube channel. She's covered the Black Dahlia case and many other true crime topics with a thoughtful and investigative approach.
And if you have credible information about the Elizabeth Short case or any unsolved case, please contact the appropriate law enforcement agency.
For this case, that means reaching out to the authorities connected to the original Los Angeles jurisdiction. And if you have case suggestions, documents, or information you believe Crime Solver Central should look into, you can reach out through the Crime Solver Central YouTube channel or our website.
Please remember, tips should be factual, specific, and made in good faith. Do not harass families. Do not accuse people online without evidence. And do not spread rumors as fact.
Elizabeth Short was more than the nickname she was given. She was a real person. Her case remains unsolved, but how we talk about her still matters.
From Crime Solver Central, I'm Charlie.
And I'm Jace.
Thank you for watching.
And until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and stay loud.